We are calling on everybody to think Africa, act Africa, and prosper Africa.
It comes down to the change of mindset.
I think this is an opportunity which Africa should not miss.
We are implementing the Africa we want.
A lot of the countries understand that this is good for them, that it is a game changer.
This is an historic moment for our continent.
So this is entirely African driven. These African countries are making a treaty among themselves.
We've been brought up with so many borders. You know, we have our little countries, we have our little economies, our little sectors. We have so many things that divide us, and I think this is an opportunity to really push against those boundaries and to change them.
As the old adage goes, there is strength in unity. For the 55 African Union member states, that strength lies in numbers. With a population of 1.2 billion and a GDP of $2.5 trillion, the prospect and now realization of a continental free trade area for Africa promises to usher in a new era of industrialization and business opportunities towards the realization of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want.
It has been a long journey, difficult and long, but we had visionaries. When we created the Organization of African Unit in 1963, President Nkrumah of Ghana made a clarion call: Africa must unite. In June 2015, the heads of state and government had an assembly in Johannesburg, and they adopted the principles for negotiations, the roadmap, as well as the institutions. And we had several rounds of negotiations. Then the regional communities came in to give technical inputs with other strategic partners, namely the African Development Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And the initial good results were established in December 2017. Then in January, we gave the report to the heads of state and government, and they were very impressed. They said the remaining work can be done in a short time, so let's have a signing ceremony on 21st March 2018 in Kigali. And we were able to produce the consolidated text that was signed today. It's composed of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area and the protocol on trade in goods, the protocol on trade in services, and the protocol on the settlement of disputes. And this is where we are.
The African Continental Free Trade Area will affect the development of African countries by boosting employment opportunities, increasing food security, increasing competitiveness of African industrial products, and enhancing participation of the continent in global trade.
For us, the African Continental Free Trade Area, of course, it's a flagship project of Agenda 2063, but more than that, it's an instrument for solidarity, and it's an instrument for connection between African people and basically dismantling the borders and the barriers that are there, because there are great opportunities for goods to move more efficiently, for services, as well as people. So I think that for us, it's a very important lever for achieving multiple objectives.
Well, what got us here is increasing realization that everywhere neighbors trade with neighbors. This is normal. What has been an anomaly for this continent is that since the 15th century, our trade has been directed primarily outside the continent. And that has to do with the way that Africa was inserted into the global economy. So this is what we are trying to reverse. So everything, our infrastructure has been built to support taking commodities from the interior to the ports and out to the north. So everything concerning trade has been organized around that external trade.
The CFTA negotiations have been complex, needing to take into consideration the individual interests of member states. Beyond the signing of the CFTA, individual countries will need to ratify the agreement.
There is supposed to be a process of ratification before the agreement can come into force. And for ratification, we need 22 member states to deposit their instruments of ratification, meaning that they have gone through their internal, local, national processes for accepting the documents. And then once we have 22 instruments of ratification, then that is when it now comes into force. The agreement that we are creating is not a mere declarative statement or a mere policy statement. It is actually a legal agreement that creates rights, obligations. So we think that at the end of the day, this is an agreement that will have some teeth. But I think beyond all that, there is a political commitment to see this done.
Intra-African trade is one of the lowest of any region globally. The impact of the CFTA will mean Africa's industrial exports are able to diversify, encouraging a move away from extractive commodities such as oil and minerals. Economic integration for the continent will further provide harmony of customs, borders, and the movement of goods.
What this initiative is all about is to say to ourselves, okay, let's create a legal framework. Let's establish a treaty so that there is certainty, because in trade, your business person wants to know that those goods that are going across are not going to be seized or discriminated against in some way, that it will be a level playing field. And also our tariffs are relatively high. Over 6% is the average across the continent. To say we want to bring this down to zero, which is what they have agreed for 90% of products, and also to deal with non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers like your roadblocks, your anti-trade behavior along the border, harassment at the border.
The flagship project of Agenda 2063 promises to be the world's largest free trade area. But what are the practical implications of having the CFTA implemented? And how exactly would an agreement of this magnitude revolutionize business and movement across Africa?
My mother was a small-scale trader after retiring from her teaching profession. So from very practical terms, having seen people like my mother, small traders, this will facilitate their movement, because alongside the signing of the CFTA, there are also member states, 27 member states, signed on to the free movement protocol, movement of persons. So cutting the red tape, knowing predictable tax regimes, common external tariff barriers. This gives them assurance, it gives them predictability, and it also gives them a sense that they have protections that are continental.
The most interesting thing to know about this kind of legal agreement is that in certain ways, it protects the little man the most. At the end of the day, for the small man, for the entrepreneur in Nigeria or some other country, the fact that there is a legal agreement that gives him rights as well as obligations actually makes it easier for that little or that young entrepreneur, that small SME company, to take the right decisions, because you know that you are not going in on your own, you are going in with the entire legal framework of the African Union.
We have signaled to the world that we want to come together, and we do not want the Africans and the rest of the world to say the leaders made a grand celebration to sign the instruments, but they are not producing results. So we are focusing on tangible results, because this is what the ordinary Africans expect. And the business community is going to join us in the advocacy program. The parliamentarians are going to join us. The civil society organizations are also going on. So Africa at large is committed.
We have to basically galvanize all the stakeholders who are going to make this happen. It's not government that's going to trade. It's the private sector. It's the young entrepreneurs. It's the cross-border traders who are women, who are going to ask the question, who should be asking the question, so what does this mean for me? So implementation, I think, will be something that happens at different levels. It will be at the national level, where countries who are signatory to the agreement first of all engage stakeholders on how to go about this. And the other level is the regional level, because as we know, regional economic communities have been working with member states, also in terms of the regional blocks, and so that's another level of implementation.
In addition to the overall contribution to achieving Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030, the average person can expect some tangible benefits on the ground from the implementation of the CFTA. Practical benefits for businesses, consumers, and trade are also on the cards.
My business is just to make those dresses for ladies, to design ladies and men. I want to make this thing bigger. I want to be there with my people, about 100 people. To bring material, it's a problem of taxes. They charge us money. If they say that no taxes, in fact, my business will go further.
I'm selling clothes. I bought them from South Africa, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi. When I'm bringing my goods back, we have problems because they ask us to pay. But if you don't want to pay, they take your goods. When you don't have all the money, you bribe.
First thing will be lack of common standard between countries, between neighboring countries. Like certain laws apply in Uganda, do not apply in Congo, and that ends up causing a lot of delays. I give you for example, I can send a product from here to Kigali, which is fine, but if I try to send it to my client in Congo, the costs and delays. That in terms of drivers have to have visas, the permit to drive in, insurance, and the law differ. Whatever they like, they can apply, and we have to obey by it. And that sometimes ends up pushing the cost higher and also increasing delays. That means instead of truck doing 2 to 3 trips a month, you end up doing 1 trip. And then for you to accommodate those costs, you have to charge your customer high. Personally, I'm very happy to see something is being worked on this area, because it's going to help us a lot in this sector.
The African Continental Free Trade Area represents a watershed for Africa in terms of trade and political relations. This seismic shift for the continent is all the more profound in the current global trend towards insular politics and isolationism. Africa's harmonization also represents the opportunity for boosting of intra-regional value chains and to attract a larger share of global investment portfolios.
Intra-African trade, minimal though it is, involves processed goods rather than raw commodities. So the point about increasing intra-African trade is that you find that African countries will need to apply more science and technology to production. So in addition to this, we are saying as a commission that it's important to emphasize education, because our aim is to have every African child in school between now and 2020. You have every African child in school, you have a numerate and a literate Africa with the cultural level raised. They can begin now to imbibe capital and leverage science and technology in production. So you find that more intra-African trade will occur, more processing will occur within the African continent.
the general populace have to be sensitized on what CFTA is, what it stands for, and what are the benefits. When that is achieved, what we call informal trade, cross-border trade, will not be informal anymore. Because all these borders, as far as trade is concerned, all these borders will become meaningless, will become fictitious. People will be free to move from one country to another. So this will take time. So I think at the beginning what needs to be done is the advocacy, public advocacy, to make sure that every single African, irrespective of their status, economic and social status, know what CFTA stands for, what are the benefits for him or her, when it becomes operational.
This platform will allow us to harmonize our different national policies, to regularize and harmonize so that we can trade amongst ourselves on the continent. We have a lot of challenges on food security. This will allow us to really, diversify our economy and really provide food in some affected countries by the climate change. For instance, we have some countries that are really highly affected by drought and all the hazard of the climate change. The region can easily facilitate the circulation of foods and animal protein from one country to another. I think it is a chance for us to really realize this inter-African trade.
While the CFTA is essentially an economic project, it is deeply entrenched in the aspirations found in Agenda 2063 and feeds directly into other aspirations for integration, such as the Single African Passport. Launched in 2016, the full implementation by member states of the Single African Passport would further enhance trade and movement of people across the continent. Other flagship projects, such as the Single African Air Transportation Market, also stand to benefit from the CFTA. The Single African Air Transportation Market primarily aims to increase connectivity across the continent by creating a single African sky, and thus further enhancing economic integration.
The essence of the Single African Air Transport Market is to have a single African sky, like the one we see in Europe, like the one we see in Northern America. Airlines, formidable airlines, licensed airlines, should be able to move from one point to another, whether on a direct flight or whether on transit. The air transport market liberalization will make sure that now business is open to everybody. And we think with liberalization now, the airfares will go down. These are some of the issues the Single African Air Transport Market is geared to resolving. A single African sky, where every airline will be able to go anywhere, to fly passengers and goods anywhere in Africa.
While the benefits of the CFTA are undoubtedly revolutionary across the continent, the African Union recognizes that the implementation of Africa's most ambitious plan to date must have the buy-in and wholly be committed to by all member states, the regional economic communities, and ultimately by citizens themselves.